So if you clicked on this video, you're probably wanting to learn C# for the first time. So if that's the case, you're in the right spot. This is going to be the first video in a series of tutorials on learning C# for the first time from no programming experience whatsoever. And eventually we're going to be able to use these skills to build our own Discord bot and make our own custom Discord bot with its own functions, and it'll be really awesome. So if you want to follow along, I'll be using the JetBrains Writer IDE, but you can just as easily follow along with Microsoft's Visual Studio. I'm going to be going maybe a little fast, so feel free to pause and rewind the video at any time and leave me any feedback for how I should create the future tutorials in the comments below. So of course everything I do in here could be mirrored in Visual Studio, and I'm going to start by creating my new solution. So if you want to follow along, we can call this tutorial video as my solution name, and my directory is just going to be, you can put this wherever you want, but it's going to be under my desktop / programming C# projects. Okay, so what's all this? Now we're in the situation. We can see in the bottom left it had a little buffer icon, so it's just loading there. Now it looks like we have a blank solution. In Visual Studio you'll probably get some more help, like you'll have a template and it might say console.writeline hello world if you selected a console app, which is what you should have selected. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new project. You probably won't have to do this on Visual Studio. But what I'm going to be doing for this solution is just a simple console application using the .NET Core 3.1 framework. And we're just going to call this tutorial app. Of course, our language is going to be C#. And we can just go ahead and create that. All right, and I'll go ahead and zoom in here. So here's the template using system namespace tutorial app. Our class, this is underlined for no reason. Let me just not show that. Class program static void main string array args. So if you've never worked with C#, you'll have no idea what any of this means, especially if you have no programming experience. And all I can say right now is just don't worry about it. We can get into things like methods and classes and all this other stuff later. This video is just the bare bones basics. So this static void main, this main class right here, every C# program needs this main class. And this string array args, for the longest time when I was learning how to program, I had no idea what this was, but it's actually just arguments that you can pass in through the command line if you decide to run your application through the command line, or in other production environments, you might have certain variables that you want to pass in through, that aren't stored in the program or in a file somewhere. You want to pass them in at application execution time. So we have this console.writeline hello world here. Well, C#, the good thing about C# is it's like English. It's written English. So you have console and then a method inside the console, like class is WriteLine. So this console.writeline method is just a part of the framework. C# and .NET, because we're using .NET Core, which is the framework upon which this application is running. .NET Core has so many functions just like this. If you type console in your IDE, and the good thing about your IDE is that it'll come up with all kinds of possible selections, but we want to do console dot, and then you have all of these methods. So eventually, obviously, you're not going to have to learn every single method for every single class in the framework, but it's just really cool how much you have access to just by exploring and messing around. You know, you can do whatever you want with the console. You can change the color, you can do anything you want. So in Visual Studio, there will be a run button somewhere around this section of the page or of the application, the IDE. On mine, it's over here. Now, if we run this, we'll get a debug output. We have hello world in the console, process finished with exit code 0. So there you go. There's your first application. This is probably everybody's first C# application. And you can see that this stop button over here, I'm pretty sure it's on Visual Studio while you're actively debugging, and we can get into debugging in a later video. But this is grayed out because the application is terminated. So if I do this, console dot, don't worry about this yet, dot read line, this will essentially keep the application from closing until I press the enter key. And we debug this. Hello world, but we didn't get our exit code 0. And our stop button is highlighted. It's available to be pressed. So now if I press enter in the console, process finished with exit code 0. So little things like this you'll pick up over time. And in a Discord bot, you actually won't need to know any of this. You won't need to worry about console.readline or anything because your application will never close until you actually close it yourself or it crashes. So there's that. I guess we can just go ahead and get into some very, very basic fundamentals of programming. And C# is a great language to learn these fundamentals in. And I learned them through watching YouTube videos myself. So I'm kind of just paying it forward. So in programming, you have variables. And the great thing about variables is that you can call them, which means, let's say you have a chunk of code that does one thing, but you want to, maybe it performs a math calculation and you want to return, that's a keyword, you want to return or spew out a value. And this is where methods come in really handy, but we can get into that later. So if I have, and by the way, in Python, you could do something like this, A equals B, or, oh my gosh, my Google just went off. I hate that. Or you can do A equals 1, 2, 3. You don't have to specify the type. And there might be a couple other languages like this, but Python is a perfect example. You know, I know R does it if you're taking a computer science course that has R. But in C# and Java and any other C-like language, because C# is a part of the C language family, you need to, I believe the term is like not statically declare your types, but it's, you have to define your types when you create the variable, unless you use the var keyword, but we can get into that later. A good habit though is by just saying int, we'll just use ABC for this, int, which means integer, A, so that's the name of our variable. So remember, in C# the syntax is type name equals value, and I'll leave that up there. So we have int A equals 2. And remember your semicolon. You always need a semicolon at the end of every single C# line you ever write. Except for a few exceptions, but we can get into that later. Like when you're creating a list or something, then you would use a comma to separate some values. So we have a little error here. Not an error, but a warning. And you would probably get this in Visual Studio too. So if we hover over it, our IDE tells us local variable A is only assigned, but its value is never used. So that means we've declared an object in our code. We've allocated space for this in memory and in code space. We've taken the time to write this. but we're not using it anywhere. So to call a variable or to reference a variable, we can do this. Int b is going to be equal to 1 plus a. And I could have an infinite amount of variables that reference a. Maybe this could be a points value, and maybe one day we want to change the value of the points or something, and we want a to be 200. Well then, instead of saying int b equals 1 plus 2, and, you know, int b, c, d, e, f, and g, whatever, 1 plus 2, and then I have to go in and say 200, 200, 200. No. We can just say a. And that's the beauty of kind of, this might be very confusing, and I hope it's not, but that's the point of declaring variables and referencing them later. Very important concept. So that's variables. And there are many, many types of variables that you'll need to learn. There are strings, and all keywords, when you type it in, it'll have this little key symbol next to it in your IDE. So there are strings, which are literally just text within double quotes. So there's text, so I could say hello, have my semicolon at the end. And I can say console.writeLine text, and this could be whatever I wanted it to be. So not only can you do console.writeLine and write the string yourself, but you can also pass in the variable. Okay? And oftentimes you'll be calling, sometimes you might need to call another value to string to convert it into printable text. Because if I try and do, I mean, I think it'll work because the .NET library is really nice to us. See, look, when I do console.writeLine, all these possible parameters show up, including integer. So I can do console.writeLine a. But let's say I make my own method to write to the console in a specific way, and it only takes in a string. But if I try to pass in a, that's an integer, and it won't work. So then I have to do a.toString. And pretty much every type will have this toString method that converts it into printable text. But don't quote me, but most of them do. So let's talk about what else is there. There are doubles, which are numbers with decimals. So you can do 200 and 0.01. But if I try and do, you know, int EFG is equal to 200.01, the compiler doesn't like that. It's not going to let that happen because an integer cannot have a decimal. There are also floats. So for consistency's sake, I'll do float c equals 200.01 again. But what's the error here? Cannot convert source type double to target type float. Oh, right, I have to put an F at the end. Sorry about that. The cool thing about floats and the difference between doubles and floats, both of them use decimals. But one thing that makes them different, and I didn't learn this until pretty recently actually, is that a double has a certain amount of decimal places that it can go up to. It might be like 10 or something. It goes pretty long. It could be infinite. But float, I think, is half of the precision as a double. So just keep that in mind. It might go to like 4 decimal places or something like that. It's just not as specific. So maybe it won't take up as much space in memory, but don't quote me. Let's see. Floats are also commonly used for like game values, like health values in video games. And so there's floats, doubles. strings, ints, those are really the basic types. But yeah, I guess just remember for this video, you know, every program needs its own main method. Args are things that can be passed in at application execution time through an external source, whether that be running it through the command line and passing it in literally through the command line or not. But, you know, that's pretty common. And remember, you have, when you're declaring a variable, you have the type, the name, equals, value. And the value, of course, has to be of the same type that the variable is declared under. So int cannot have a decimal. Double can actually be, like, you could actually write double b is equal to 100, but if you know you're not going to ever use a decimal, just leave it as an integer. And finally, just a little bonus, you can also use the var keyword to have the language, C#, determine what the variable is automatically. So you can do var x equals test. You're not going to get an error. Var y equals 1, 2, 3. So that works as well. And var is really good if you have a type that's really long, such as, like, you know, don't worry about what all this means, but you could have I enumerable of, you know, type or object. You know, that's a bit long. Instead, you could just write var. So it can save some space there. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have any questions, leave them down in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for what I should post next, just let me know. Thanks.